Welcome to the LiveCast Conversations With. On this show, my guests and I explore the bumps and triumphs of their journey to extract the gems from their experiences, because success leaves clues, and today we turn those clues into billboards for you. I'm your host, Gene Bernier, founder of Pealed Back, speaker and co-active coach, guiding leaders to ruthlessly pursue a life worth living. Hey everybody, welcome to episode 97. My guest today is Robbie Holmes. Robbie started his 27-year career in technology as a developer, and over many experiences has moved throughout the ranks of technology leadership. He's passionate about creating diverse, inclusive, candidate-focused hiring processes, and is an advisor on hiring reforms. He has been able to assist in the creation of high-performing technical teams and cultures. Through these improvements, the organizations he's worked with have experienced an increased effectiveness on delivering on their mission. Robbie, thank you so much for being on the show today, brother.
It's good to see you, man. Thanks for having me on.
This is great. And, as we were talking about beforehand, we've got some connections through our old Drupal alliances and experiences.
Yeah, really good people in that community in general, but it's amazing how many, and we were talking before about the connective tissue that the Drupal community has created across so many different organizations, whether it's public or private, or it's unreal the depth and reach that community has built.
Oh yeah, and for like Drew Stevens, he's been on the show I think 3 times now, right? Like just excellent opportunities, and just seeing where people have spread out from like the early days of 2008 and beyond, as and we were talking about the companies and the creations and the opportunities, and that's kind of like what we're talking with you today is the what it means to be within community and the opportunities around transcending potentially into civic technology and how that plays a really big role. And you shared something that really struck me is like when you were talking about the civic space, it's just like good people doing good things, and how part of what you're looking for is like more people to do more good things.
Yeah, I've been lucky enough to get a chance to sort of work at almost every level of government. My bingo card is full except for international at this point. I work for the city of New York, the state of New York. I work currently in Prince William County in Virginia as their director of digital services. And I've worked in the federal government as a member of the United States Digital Service. So while I was there, I worked for the Executive Office of the President. I worked for the Department of Veterans Affairs and Department of Homeland Security. I also, when you work at USDS, you're kind of a chaos monkey in government at times. You're brought in to sort of help and support things. And I think what's good about that is it also means that we have a fraternity or sorority of people across federal agencies. We often talk about it like a franchise model. So the team at the VA is USDS. The team at the headquarters in the Executive Office of the President is USDS. The team at HHS in the Center for Medicare and Medicaid is USDS. But we all meet every week in our staff meeting. So there's always this back channel of people. So we have our internal Slack that we talk on and things like that. But that meant that like Drupal is a funny way to connect this, because while I was at USDS, I was the only person who had Drupal experience. So if you said Drupal 3 times, I magically appeared. And I have a DrupalCon tattoo on the back of my leg, which is always made for some interesting moments in my life. But it turned out that the person who was the community practice lead for engineering, we hadn't really met. It was early in my time there, and IRS.gov was being rebuilt in Drupal. They were doing a beta. And it was super funny because somebody was just like asking a question about Drupal, and someone just goes like, Robbie's got a Drupal tattoo on the back of his leg. And Kim Rackmiller was the community practice lead. And she's just like, hi, Robbie, you're part of my community. Could you answer a question? And I was like, yeah, sure. So that it turned out that I ended up being a resource for the IRS team on the back end. Cool. And it was super fun to like talk to, there was a designer there, and there was a content strategist, and they were working at the time, I think might have even been phase 2 working on IRS.gov and one component of it. But it was really fun because that led to the first time I got to go bowl at the Truman Bowling Alley in the White House, or in the executive office, in the EEOB, in the Eisenhower Executive Office building. But it was to go and take IRS team, the members of the IRS team, to go bowl. And I got brought along because I was like a secret shadow member of the team, which was really cool.
It's like when they say Drupal, that tattoo starts to light up. Be like, oh, there's trouble. I gotta go.
Yeah, it really does. When I worked at Google, that was a really funny one where somebody was walking behind me, and I'm a burly dude with lots of tattoos, and I'm walking in the hallway, and some guy just goes, "Say, Drupal?" And I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "What are you going to do when Drupal no longer exists?" I'm like, "Everything on my leg changed my life." Like, whether or not Drupal succeeds, which I think it probably will. It's somebody wrote an article recently talking about how Drupal's a shark and not a dinosaur, like because it continues to evolve.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of true. But I think it was really funny that this person was like immediately ready to crush this technology. And I was like, it changed my life. Like I was an IT guy for the first 12 or 13 years of my life. And then I started building websites for family and friends and realized I didn't want to be their content management system.
Oh.
So I started looking around, and you'll get a kick out of this. Like I initially looked at Joomla because I was like, Drupal seems really complicated. And I looked at Joomla, and I was a network engineer, and I worked in a network operations center. And Joomla asked you to put in FTP credentials so it could auto update itself. And I was like, no, I don't think that's a good idea at all. So I immediately was like, Drupal has a big community, it seems like. So I pivoted back and started building websites at that point for friends and family using Drupal.
Yeah.
And that led to me going out to a meetup. So I think the first meetup I went to first technology meetup, was a Drupal NYC meetup. And I think there was 5 of us at the meetup. So what's funny is I know 4 of those people still to this day. Sam Tressler, Scott Trudeau, Jacob Redding, and Noel Hidalgo.
Wow.
And then the last person, we're not sure who it was. We think it might be the guy who owns DrupalNYC.com. I think I met him years later, but we're not sure if it was him. But the 4 of us are actually friendly and we still get along. But Jacob went on to be like the Drupal Association lead for the Drupal Association. Sam has built and done DevOps work for every company on the planet. Noel brought Drupal to at the time, I think it was he brought it into New York State. So every senator in New York State got their own instance of Drupal. So that happened, and then he brought it to the UN. So Noel was leading that team.
Yeah.
And Scott Trudeau founded Apartment. He was the CTO for Apartment Therapy in New York City. So like it was an amazing group of people that like really was the backbone of getting me to think I could do this professionally. You know, literally Sam, when we were walking to the train that night, he was like, "You know enough about Drupal, just go and be a contractor. Like go off and do it on your own now. Like knock it off." Because I was tired of working in IT, and he was like, he just my champion from very beginning. Like he's such a good dude.
That's funny. And it's always interesting when you look back to see where those seeds were that's just like started it all, right? Like you got into it, you found it, you pivoted like that one big change going, I don't think this is safe to let some piece of software just go and update on itself, right? Like, and from there, like an incredible career and friendships and connections and communities have sprung forth from that one decision.
Yeah, and it was community that led me across the board into my career. For years, I would tell people, like, you can blind send your resume. When I was working in IT, before I got my first job in the Drupal ecosystem, I probably sent out 500 or 600 resumes in the year before looking for a job and got, maybe 5 responses. So, like, my response rate was insanely low. But I'm also, like, a guy who, at the time, had, like, 12 or 13 years of experience, no degree from college. But I had been working on really large scale, impactful stuff, but I didn't know how to talk about it as effectively at that point in my life. One of the last projects I worked on for this, when I was working in the city of New York, was we were using HP OpenView to monitor the servers. And at that time, HP charged the license based on the number of CPUs and the operating system that it was running against. So I think it was like a Solaris 64 core license was like $80,000 or something like that for one box. Yeah. So I was like, this seems ridiculous. So we ended up looking around and we pivoted over, and now we can start the GIF and GIF fight. Nagios was what I ended up moving towards, and we started monitoring everything using Nagios. And then we found an open source PHP solution that did a UI for it. And they charged like 15 grand, and that included like 20 or 30 hours of maintenance. So we pivoted and saved the city of New York like $22 million in the last year I was there. And it was just an amazing experience. And I was like, open source, man, this makes sense. And I was already building using open source. So I sort of became this like secret or not so secret open source advocate and evangelist for a while, no matter where I was. But that community was amazing. So I at one of the early Drupal meetups, Lullabot was in town because they were working on Sony stuff. So I got to meet, I think it was at the time, I think it might have been Webchick, Nathan, Haug, and one other person, maybe Addy. Could have been Eaton, but I met like 3 or 4 Lullabot people, and the person who was leading the team at Sony, his name was Doug, and he came over with them. They had like dinner, and then they came over to the meetup because they were in town. And you know, at the time, the Drupal meetups were like 6-8 people in New York. Yeah. And it was super cool because most of the Lullabot folks were not from big city areas. A lot of them are actually from the Midwest. And so they were in New York, and they were like, oh, there's a Drupal meetup going on tonight. We should go and hang out. And they came in, and we ended up having a really great conversation. And I was so nervous, I never even talked to Doug, who was the person at Sony. Yeah. So like the next day or 2 days later, I sent him a message, I think through Drupal.org, and said like, hey, I'm the guy, the big burly dude. I met you the other night. And I'd love to like talk to you about opportunities at Sony. And I like reached out because of that connection. Right. And there was some chaos about like what they thought I was looking for. But about 7 months later, my friend Susie Arnold ended up, she was working there as a contractor, and Doug was leaving to go work in another company. And they made Susie the interim boss and eventually the boss. And she reached out and she was like, Robbie, so like at meetups and at Drupal Camp NYCs, I had gotten to know Susie. So she called me out of the blue and she was like, are you in the market? And I was like, for what? And she's like, I became Doug. And I'm like, Doug at Sony? And she's like, yeah. And she's like, come have coffee. And I was like, yeah. So that led to my job. Like literally, it was me being at these meetups and reaching out and getting to know people. And, you know, at that point I was probably helping out with Drupal Camp NYC. So it was like Tom Turnbull and early people there that were helping out on that community. And that led to those people eventually working at Sony, right? Like, so I worked at Sony, I'm gregarious, I'm out at meetups, and I'm bringing people like, we need to hire people. So like, you know, it was super fun to be able to connect the dots for people, whether it was for me or go to NBC or going down to the stock exchange. You know, I knew all the players. So it was pretty easy because I was running the meetups, you know?
That's pretty cool. And it, you know, within all that is like, what I hear is, you were doing all these things without that ulterior motive, because you were being you and gregarious and just like bringing life to this. People were like, he's a good guy. Oh, and he knows what he's talking about. We need somebody that knows what they're talking about.
Some of those early meetups were so much fun when I got to finally know. So when I was working at Sony Music, I got to know the Treehouse Squad, which eventually became part of Phase 2 technology, where we both worked at one point. And I think the interesting piece there is, you know, we had such amazing humans that were part of that team, but I got a chance to go and hang out with those people, and I often would go into the room at the beginning of the meetup and say like, here are the meetup parameters. This is the talks that we're doing tonight. We would try to do like 5-minute quick talks, 15-minute or 25-minute deep dives. So we would try to have a series of talks every night. We had a big enough meetup at that point where we could probably pull it off. And what was great was Stephen Merrill is still one of the greatest technologists I've ever worked with. And I got to know him through the community. And what was amazing is I could often point to Stephen and say, like, we have no topics tonight. Do you have something you're doing at your job that you can talk about? And Stephen would whip together a presentation in 5 minutes and like be up there talking, because he would mostly show code and he would be able to talk through it. But what was amazing was like early on, I remember connecting the dots for Treehouse, or might have been right after the acquisition. But Estee Lauder came in and they had a bunch of questions, and they were talking about building a platform and caching specifically. And they had some questions. And I was like, the guy presenting right now is Stephen Merrill. He works at, it was either Treehouse or Phase 2. And I'm like, you should talk to him because he has a lot of practical experience in what you're asking about. Right. And at the time, Joe Cacavano was there. And I grabbed Joe and I was like, Joe, you should talk to the Estee folks and you should grab Stephen when he's done. And that led to the Estee contract happening at Phase 2, which is so cool. But like, that was the kind of stuff that happened all the time. But I also would pull the newbies out of the room. Like if you were going to have a presentation that was too in depth that it would lose somebody new to Drupal, I would grab friends and I would say like, let's go to the table outside and do like a Drupal newbie session. So it would be like me and Alex Ross from NBC, or, Eric Duran, who is at Lullabot, or, all these people, and just pull them to the table and say, like, if you have questions, we'll answer them. Like I currently at the time was working at Sony Music. I'm like, I can talk about the Sony platform. I can talk about tech, but like it really opened up this entire environment for us to be able to support both like the intermediate and senior level people and people who were new. And then that even led to like the Drupal happy hour in New York City, which was like Roger Lopez is a good friend of mine. And Roger was like, I don't want to go to meetups anymore. Like I'm done listening to presentations. He was like a technical architect on the platform at Sony Music and leading the team. He was like, but I want to get to know the community. And he was like, I was like, all right, let's do like a happy hour. So we started running Drupal meetups, which was like one to many. And then the Drupal happy hour was like, bring your face and not your laptop and get to meet your next boss.
Yeah.
And then that slowly pivoted. And then there was Drupal Play Days that my friend John Zavaki started. And John it was originally for like theming, right? It was originally called the Drupal Themers Happy Hour or Play Day. And he kept getting technical questions. So like his second one, he was like, Robbie, can you come and answer questions? And I was like, yeah. So I showed up, and like the next one, he was like, I can't make it, and you're running it. And so now I had 3 events I was running in New York for that community. And but what was great was they were all different, right? Like the one-to-many aspect of a meetup is really powerful, especially for the right people. The happy hour was fantastic for getting people connected to the community and one another and getting to know companies, right? Like having somebody come in and they're in the market. And you can say like, hey, Gene, you should go talk to Robbie. They have an opening at Sony. He might be able to help you, right? Like, and I could do that behind the scenes. But then the play days were super fun because it was like a break fix situation. So like if, say we had Gene was coming in and Deborah last week had a problem with like a views theming question. And Gene came in and said, like, I'm having a problem. I have a view and I'm not sure how to make it look the way I want it to. I can be like, hey, Deborah, you remember last week when we walked through this? Can you help Gene? So it was a secret way of like leveling the community up that became unbelievably powerful, and it got a lot of people experience. I think I was more proud of that meetup in New York than almost any other because I watched people get hired, right? Like you can see the connective tissue of the meetup itself, but when you're actively watching people build side projects that eventually are things they show off in their interview, and then they come back and they like, I got this job, like that's amazing,
And they're ready to give back. That's like that connective tissue is so important, and the way that you maybe manage is the wrong word, but like is like that idea of like, oh, we're gonna pull the beginners out and give them like that soft launch into it, because being new to any group, that it can be really, really hard, regardless of the topic or the industry or what's going on. Being like, I don't know the inside jokes and I don't know what they're talking about, and this is scary. And you pull them all aside and going, hey, we're going to help you get here because we know what's going to happen on this other side, because you're welcome, and we want to make sure that you come back for more.
Well, and I think the interesting thing is I learned how to be a community organizer in New York in that Drupal community because they was very small when I started, and I saw the things I was concerned about, and I'm empathetic enough that I realized that this is probably, the thing I realized over the years is that being an extrovert like I am, the hardest thing for someone to do who's an introvert is just walk in the door, right? Like just getting to the door and walking in the door. So one of the things I realized early on was I treated everybody at the door the same. So you'd walk in, if I knew your name, I would say like, hey, Gene, good to see you again. Remember, bathrooms are over there. You can grab a soda over there. We're going to start meetup in about 15 minutes. Go inside, get set up. The Wi-Fi information's on the board, right? And what you realize slowly is, as a person who ran a lot of meetups and also was a part of a lot of tech communities in New York that I didn't run, that if you saw me at another meetup, it was a friendly face that had been nice to you when you walked in.
Right.
So I eventually I started the Angular New York City meetup when I was working at Google, because Igor and Mishka, who were and Brad, the original team on Angular in Mountain View, wanted to start a meetup in New York City. And they were like, myself and a bunch of us went from Sony to Zagat, and Zagat, we got acquired by Google. So I brought along a lot of people who I could drag to meetups. So our team in Google actually had a bunch of people who were early Drupal community members or people who presented a bunch that I could force to present because I work with them. And so when it came down to it, Andrew, who was our tech lead, wanted to run it. And I was like, that's amazing. I'm so excited to help you. Like, let me know what I can do. But it was unbelievable to be able to kick off the Angular meetup in New York City and have the presentations and early meetups actually have Igor and Mishka, the team from Angular in Mountain View, talk to the public, right? Like, So we had the technology, because Google's technology is good, that we could actually run the meetup and have them live from Mountain View answer questions.
Mm-hmm.
And that was awesome. We had presentations, but then it was like, Igor's going to stick around and do a Q&A for 15 minutes at the end of this meetup. Like, you should stick around and grab a sandwich and a beer and come over and talk to Igor, like, on camera, you know?
Yeah.
It's a really different experience. And that was the same thing. Like, you'd walk into the Angular meetup and I'm like, hey, how you doing? I'm Robbie. We got sandwiches, beers are over there, right? Like, and then that led to other things where the Google community has an open meetup that is the Google tech stuff, no matter what it is. And I would often be one of the people, Google would ask people to be like wranglers. So that way, like, the speaker wasn't bombarded by 500 people with questions.
Yeah.
If it was like, what's it like to work at Google question? Or like, we could be like, hey, how you doing? I work here, you know? But it used to make me laugh because I would be there at those events and welcoming people in the door, and people would come in and they'd be like, I saw you last night at the Python meetup, or I saw you, and I'd be like, yeah, I go to meetups. Like, they're like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, I work here. And they're like, that's crazy, you know? And you still come to the meetup? And I was like, yeah, they asked for support. So like, that's what you do, you know? And yeah, the community aspect, it carried over. Like, so I moved from New York in 2015 to the DMV, the DC, Maryland, and Virginia area. And I moved into Virginia. And when I was doing that, I was running Node School events in New York City. So I love the Node School pattern and paradigm. Here's a workshop that you install on your machine, and it teaches you sort of the basics and then the advanced topics eventually in Node.js or the ancillary modules that you would be using. And I loved it. I thought it was so cool. I went to a Node.js conference in New York, and they had breakout sessions where you could go to do like Node bot stuff, which was like, you know, flying a helicopter using Node. And then there was another one, and there was a Node school. And I was really intrigued by this idea of yet another way to engage with community. So I went, and what was cool is our tables were basically a team, and you would get up and go ring a bell and mark that you had completed something. So It was really like visceral. The person who ran it was actually the guy from Baltimore. So he ran Charm City JS and was running a Node School event out of there. So I started talking to him, and I was like, so this is pretty great. Like, what? And then I came back. I went back in New York and started running these events and trying to find a JavaScript community I could help. So we started running Node School events, and then I moved. So I started looking, and there's a GitHub org for all the Node schools in the world. And I looked up the Node School DC, and it was so I found the GitHub account that was associated with it, and nobody was running any meetups. Yeah. So I found it was this guy named Josh Finney, and Josh, I sent him a direct message because his handle there was actually the same thing on Twitter. And I started messaging him, and I'm like, I'm about to move here. I'd love to help out with Node School. So I moved on a Friday, and on Monday, I went to the Nova Node meetup, the Northern Virginia Node meetup. And I walk in, and the two organizers are like, hey, you seem like you're new here. I don't recognize you. And I was like, yeah. They were like, you just moved to the area? And I was like, yeah, I moved from New York. And they were like, oh, are you the guy that's been bugging Josh about running Node School events? And I was like, yeah. And they're like, we're running an unconference in like 3 weeks. Do you want to run a Node School at it? And I was like, yeah. And they like immediately made me like an admin on the meetup. And I was like, this is amazing. So what I've written a little bit about in the past and thought a lot about is these communities became like my new friend group, right? Like, I'm an adult and I'm not connected to a ton of ways to meet new friends, but my community, right? I joke around that like I'm a lapsed Catholic. So my way of giving back and my community, tech community is my community, right? Like, yeah. So I help, and I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for people who did it for me, you know, like, so we can go all the way back to the beginning, right? Like I went to a Drupal meetup with 5 people, you know, and that meetup is what led me to my career in lots of ways. Like I would have probably found a path, but I don't know that it would have been this randomness of like my first gig in the Drupal ecosystem is Sony Music, where I managed the platform, you know, like, but it was a great synergy of my skill set. Like I was an IT person. I could talk. I knew Drupal's APIs backwards and forwards because I had been building sites. And I also had this ability to like, I understood databases and I understood servers. I was a sysadmin for a long time. So I filled this really weird niche at Sony, which was like, we need somebody to manage the platform who can talk to a DBA, who can talk to a systems administrator, who can talk to our cloud team, who can talk to the engineers. And I almost acted as like a backstop for tickets. Like I would review them and say like, this should go on to the engineering team. This is crap. We don't need to do this. Or I would just fix it if it was some low hanging fruit. And that really just transitioned me from being this sort of IT minded person to, by the time I was there for 6 or 8 months, I think I had a relatively complicated technical issue that I felt like should go to the engineers. And I pulled my friend Roger and I was like, I think I troubleshot it and it looks like it's here. And he's like, I haven't looked at that code in 6 months. You know it better than I do. Just fix it. So like that started me writing more and more code, was this weird transition of like, mashing your skills together. And it was also just a confidence build, having an amazing like team that I worked with that really was super supportive. And they were like excited that I was doing maintenance. Like they were like, great, I don't want to do that anyways.
No developer really does, right?
I used to say to Roger, was one of my favorite developers. He's one of the smartest engineers I ever worked with. And he's like, it's just because I'm lazy. I don't want to write it again. And I was like, that is so amazing. Like, it's so perfect for that type of engineer. Like he's amazing.
Well, I love that. But again, like there's this component as well. It's like you keep taking the first steps. That's what I hear in all your stories. Is like, well, I don't know where to go, but I think it's kind of over this way. I want to be around people, and that's where the good things happen. Cool, I'm going to take a step. And there is a bit of like you talked about the introverts before. Like, there are people that would look at that and go, I got to take a step and be around people. Be like, I don't want to be the first. There always has to be a leader in that room, right? And having that personality that can pull them in and actually like kind of like put them under your wing a little bit as well, and be like, don't worry, this will get good, and you'll grow from here.
Yeah, I think the interesting piece is like I come across confident. I joke. I used to give a talk about imposter syndrome, and I used to say that I had to start off with privilege because I have privilege, right? Like I'm a cisgendered white guy who looks like a stereotype of a programmer, right? Like I have more hair on my face than on my head. I'm a chubby dude with a terrible metabolism, crappy eyes. I have lots of tattoos, right? But in the end, I would often say that like imposter syndrome is like the honey badger of feelings, right? Like it doesn't care if you shouldn't feel it or you don't look like the part. It is going to get you. And I suffered from pretty terrible imposter syndrome most of my career, because of the fact that like I often joke that there are lots of terrible ways that imposter syndrome impacts you. As a person who was an IT person for a really long time, my natural tendency, I think the thing I have in spades that a lot of people don't is I have a really good gut instinct for troubleshooting problems, which made me good in IT. But it also it's a different skill set that you use when you become a developer. And I think you can utilize that skill set, but it's not exactly the same. Like I was the person who could solve any networking problem because I knew the basics of networking and some of the intermediate layers of networking. And I knew the systems we worked on. And I would have a feeling like this is probably where the problem is. And you realize over time that does happen once you get to know the engineering side of the house. So like, I troubleshot. I think one of my favorite moments at Sony Music was we were utilizing the Twitter module that was written by Eaton from Lullabot. And it was on Chris Daughtry's website. And we were hitting the Twitter Geddon when the number became larger than a double for the IDs. And it just was dying silently. So no tweets were updating on the homepage. And I'm literally troubleshooting it by console logging, or basically logging out errors all the way. So I finally talked to Eaton about it, and he was just like, how'd you figure out where it was? And I'm like, dude, I just DSM'd everywhere. Like I just dumped everything out as every step of the way. And he just started laughing. He's like, well, you narrowed it down to the method where this is going sideways. And I was like, yeah. It turned out there was a bug in the 64-bit version of PHP and the 64-bit version of Nginx, of Apache, and specifically writing to a number that was larger than the column size. So it didn't error out. It just skipped. It just like it bombed and didn't tell you. And I was like, this is the worst swallowed error of all time. Like he's tweeting, I see it come in, nothing on the site. Like, and Daughtry cared about his Twitter feed on the site. It was like something he cared about. So we figured it out, and we ended up, it's the ongoing joke of everything in Drupal just really wanted it at that time because it was PHP 5-ish, 5.5, 5.6. but everything just wanted to be a string is what it felt like. So we just like cast the Twitter ID as a string and updated the column in the table to be a string. And I was like, Eaton, how do you feel? And he's like, terrible. Like, and I was like, all right, like, let's just do it and get this live. Cause it started working on our test site. And I was like, but it was one of those things that like, I didn't realize just how valuable that sort of gut instinct of troubleshooting was.
Yeah.
But I also sort of carried over the imposter syndrome for a really long time. Like I worked at Sony and then went to Zagat, where I became a principal engineer there. And I got to work on some big stuff at Zagat. I worked on the ads integration. I worked on all this cool stuff. But then I got acquired by Google. So, I would often feel like I came in the side door at Google. I didn't go in through an interview process, right? So you realize like every once in a while I would have this really funny interaction where somebody would just be like, what's your alma mater? And I'd be like, NA. And they're like, North American? And I'd be like, not applicable. And they're like, oh, so where'd you go and get your bachelor's? I'm like, haha, nowhere. And so you realize after about 4 or 5 of those interactions in your first year, like, oh, you're a unicorn. They don't understand you at all. Like, so I even said, like, to people for a long time, I think being at Google was fantastic for convincing me that I was smart enough and I could do the job. But it also like compounded my imposter syndrome in really, really bad ways.
Right.
Because you always have this lingering component of meeting a new Googler who doesn't know you, knows you came in through an acquisition. You're just one of those guys that knew Drupal or JavaScript, right?
Right.
It was rough. It was a tough time. And then I think the thing that finally helped assuage my real imposter syndrome, a good friend of mine, Randall, we worked together at USDS, and I was talking about giving a talk on imposter syndrome, and he's like, dude, you've been here at USDS for like 4 years and you've had 4 projects go live. There are people who spend 4 years at USDS and nothing goes live. Like the consistency on these projects is you were a part of them. And it was a really great moment of having somebody who I respect a lot take a step back and say like, bro, like you belong here and you did great work. And that really helped tamp down for the first time in 25 years of my career, probably the imposter syndrome to be like at a really reasonable level, as opposed to like, it is burning in the back of your head all the day,
Yeah. Like, when are they going to find out? Oh my God, is today the day?
Yeah. Well, it's that, the double whammy is you're worried about constantly being found out as being the person who doesn't or isn't qualified to do the job. Yeah. Then there's also the other one where you're like, you're afraid to do your job, right? Being an engineer isn't about knowing the answer. It's about solving the problem. And sometimes that's Googling, right? Like I've said for years, like working in environments where you can't Google, like, I think the stock exchange was an example where I knew people on the teams in the stock exchange in New York that weren't able to get to the internet. Their computers were definitely offline. So that meant they couldn't get to Drupal. They couldn't get to api.drupal.org. They couldn't get to php.net. So they were people I knew that actually had like many books that they brought with them into their office. And I'm like, the worst part of that is that's not how we work, right? No. Like, any language in any framework I ever work in, I know that I can say, like, I know this probably has a substring method that exists. Yeah. If I have a string, I can get a piece of the string. So you say name of language or framework, substring, and then you go to the API, right? Like, and then you look at it and you're like, well, this is PHP. So obviously the needle and haystack are wrong, but like we can figure it out. It's in the API, it used to make me laugh that was the worst part of watching these people who are friends of mine get those jobs. I'm like, you're either going to come out like a hardened developer with way more skills, or you're just going to be like, I don't belong doing any of this. and it's because like you're just working in a really artificial environment,
Yeah. Well, I think that's true, and right, I'm having flashbacks to my high school teachers when we had the graphing calculators. Be like, you're not going to have a graphing calculator and access to this kind of stuff wherever you go. Be like, haha, you were wrong.
I have more power in my pocket in my iPhone than that graphing calculator ever did. Yeah, I think it's funny. I've seen so many people try to tackle big problems. I think the thing I realized years ago is what led me to USDS is I was at phase 2 at the time, and I read a blog post written by Mikey Dickerson about healthcare.gov, and he was the administrator for USDS at the time. And he talked about the fact that like he walked in the door and he asked about how they knew healthcare.gov was offline. And I think somebody said like they turned on the television, and if CNN was yelling at them about it, they knew it was down. And Mikey's answer was like, we know how to monitor things, right? Like, which I think is such a practical and that like here I am at the time I was working at phase 2. I'm doing all these amazing, projects that I'm a part of. Like we had talked about a little bit before, like I got a chance to help out with Major League Soccer's platform. And I helped out over on, people.com with their integration of a giant ads platform. And we did some really cool stuff. And the last project I worked on was NBA.com, which was an amazing, like, bleeding edge project. At the time, it was like in Drupal 8 beta, and it was using like Angular 2 when it was in beta before it actually launched. And so it was like the most bleeding edge project I had ever worked on. But like they were building out something really unique and different, because NBA and Turner was really doing some really cool stuff with video streams and real-time data for the games that were happening. So they were building components that were being inflated using observables, like really cool, different things that you don't often think about Drupal for. And I was so impressed with it. And then I read this blog post, and it was literally about like, how do you know if healthcare.gov is down? Like, well, let's just monitor it. And then once we have a monitoring, we can get metrics, and then we can get some logs and figure. So we now know when it's up or down. We can build some metrics that says like, when this thing gets too high, it's probably going to blow up. And then we can say like, let's look at the log and see why that thing's so high. Right. Like, and I felt so akin to that troubleshooting. It reminded me so much of my IT life. Right. That like that gut instinct of checking and trying to solve a problem. And I looked at somebody and I was like, I think I can use my skills to help America. Like, that's crazy, And so I submitted my resume, and it took them, I think I submitted it in like October, and my birthday's December 1st. And I got an email on my birthday that said like, we'd like to interview you. And I responded back to the talent person, and I was like, you just gave me a really good birthday present. Like, let's figure out a time. This is really cool. And they were like, what are you talking about? I'm like, today's my birthday. And she was just like, that's amazing. Like, and I went through the interview process and eventually landed at the VA. And that like really was the epitome of like transitioning. Like you were talking about, like taking that first step. I read this blog post, and Jordan Hirsch, who just founded his coaching organization, Jordan and I were talking about using some of the technologies that USDS was utilizing. So they like helped them, and 18F built out the US web design system, and it was being utilized across federal government. And I was like talking to Jordan at the time about like, we should put together a package for how phase 2 can work. And we already have this back channel of knowing how the government is currently working. So it would really help phase 2, like grow the public sector piece. They were already doing a bunch of work, but I felt like this was an easy one that everything's public. The USDS team, 18F, we're all putting everything out in the public space. So why not leverage that and be smart, right? Like, this is how companies grow. And so he and I were like spending a lot of time looking at it. And then all of a sudden I was like telling the company, I'm like, yeah, sorry, Jordan. The thing I was talking about with US web design system? I'm going to work for the group that built that, and some of our friends. And so it was a really funny transition of going from like, talking about how we could use this at phase 2 to like transitioning into the government. And I think one of the things we had talked about earlier that I think is really important that I don't know that everybody gets, right, is I grew up in Brooklyn, and I had no access or had no understanding of what government was. And then you end up in a position like me where I ended up joining the USDS and worked for the executive office of the president eventually, but I worked for the VA for a long time. And you realize just like how much the government is made of people, right? Like it is good people doing their best to try to solve problems. And I think the thing that we don't think about is how we can support that. So in my time at USDS, I think I interviewed 400 engineers in the interviewing process because I really cared about setting up USDS for its future. At USDS, we worked in a Schedule A employees, which meant we could do 2 years and re-up and do 2 more years. So you could do 4 years total. You weren't a full-time government employee. There's lots of reasons for that, but that ended up being the case. But what was great was it also meant that at the end of 4 years, we would transition out and someone else would take that spot. So it created a culture of like not allowing people to stagnate. People were continually bringing in new experiences and new skill sets. And what I've done, and I did while I was there, is I supported the talent team a lot by just taking phone calls with people who were interested in USDS and couldn't figure out if it was the right place for them. So I did a lot of that in my time at USDS. And I was even saying to you, like in the last week, I've talked to 2 people who are trying to break into civic tech in some way, shape, or form. Someone who's on a hiatus and taking a sabbatical from their job to see if they can make it into the civic tech space, and somebody who is transitioning out of being a biotech person and has done a bunch of development and now thinks they would like to do something in the civic tech environment. And I care so much about trying to get more people to do that, because there's very few places you can have the type of impact you can have. Like the example I often give is like when I joined USDS, I was working at the VA and we were digitizing the healthcare application.
Right.
So as a veteran, you could apply at the time using a hosted PDF that only worked in Adobe Acrobat 8.5 and below and Internet Explorer 10 and below. And the problem was, like, if you had the wrong version of Adobe Acrobat, it would tell you to upgrade your browser. So like, not only was it bad, it was actively lying to you,
Right.
and lying to veterans, people who needed it the most, right? And we realized after a while doing user research that the audience for this was slowly becoming only people at libraries could actually apply. So homeless veterans were using library computers to apply because they hadn't yet upgraded past these deprecated versions.
Right.
So when we originally looked at it, I think it was getting less than 60 submissions a day for the healthcare application. But like, we rebuilt it. We built a React form that was utilizing modern responsive design. And we built a back end that would talk to the SOAP system that old hosted PDF worked on. So we built all of these pieces and we put it out in the public. And within the first week, we got like over 600 submissions a day.
Oh, wow.
And years later, I think it was Matt Cutts was the administrator at the time. I think it was a cake that had the number 500,000 on it. And it was this really impactful moment of him saying, like, those of you that worked on this form, this has been now submitted over 500,000 times.
Wow.
And when you start to think about that, I think the statistics are something like 1 in 5 or 1 in 8 veterans who doesn't have healthcare benefits commit suicide. And he's like, there are more veterans alive today because of the work you did. And those are the kind of things that are like really hard to think about. Where can I work and have the kind of impact? You know, like when I interviewed at the USDS, one of the last cycles of people I talked to was Marina Martin. She was the CTO at the VA. And we had this long conversation, and then she sent me an email at the end. And she said, you know, every time you commit code to our GitHub repo, you'll be helping 8 million veterans. And I was like, that is pretty amazing, right? Like, it's 8 million veterans, 22,000 family members, service members, right? When you start to think about those numbers and how you can impact those people's lives, it's really unbelievable, you know?
And there's on-ramps to that, and what I hear as well is, like we talked about before the show, that's not a place where your creativity goes. Like, you get to bring it in spades.
Oh yeah. And you know, sometimes what's really great is the agencies, there's a large group of people that are trying to really change the way that agencies solve problems. So there is plenty of work to be done following those people's footsteps. There's a lot of good consulting companies that are winning work in places where USDS was, or 18F is or was, right? And has been transitioning the culture a little bit. You know, looking at things like the playbook, playbook.cio.gov, which is the plays of how USDS does delivery in government, right? And the digital services coalition companies, there's 26 of them, all believe in that playbook as how to deliver in government and do good government technology. So there's lots of companies that are doing it. And it's really interesting to see how many companies today are actually trying desperately to do good work in the government, and how many agencies are actually starting to allow that to happen and also driving that work themselves, right? Like, a friend of mine is at NGA, he's the deputy CTO, and he has created so much opportunity and so much change and has had such a huge impact on NGA as an organization. And you know, he's been there 3 years, and he wrote a post the other day saying that, like, normally this is when I'd be looking for something else, but I'm really love this place, and I feel like I have a great team here and we're doing great things. And like, cool. That stuff can happen, you know? And we were using modern technology, right? Like, we built, the front end was React. We were using the US web design system for design and for layout. And then there was, you know, Ruby on Rails on back ends. There was Node. There was, like, you know, there's a lot of things that are being done, and almost everything is in the cloud. Almost every agency is moving to the cloud at this point. So if you care about, you know, cloud-based engineering or cloud native application development, that is also on the table, and you can bring those skills into the government. There's a lot of space that people wouldn't realize they can actually have the impact they can have. And it doesn't have to be like a dead end for your skill set.
That's very cool. Well, Robbie, how I said before we got started that we were going to fly past the 40-minute mark. Totally. We're at 44 minutes, and I imagine we could keep going here today, but I want to be respectful of your time, sir. A lot of great things have been brought up, especially around the community, taking those first steps, and there's a lot of good work still to be done in that civic space, and there's a lot of on-ramps that people might not know what to do with. Mm-hmm. Before we get into the last question, I'd like to give you an opportunity to give a shout out to anything that you want to bring attention to around connecting with you, or opportunities, or anything along those lines.
Yeah, I think if you are interested in supporting government, no matter what it is, no matter what level, there is a way for you to do that. There are organizations like Code for America, which engage and they do fellowships with cities and states. There is digital service organizations popping up inside of states and cities, right? Like New Jersey has a team, New York has a team, Colorado has an amazing team. California has 3 teams. They have one in San Francisco. They have one in Sacramento. Like there's a lot of really good organizations out there. And then if you're looking to volunteer, Code for America supports this idea of brigades. So there are volunteer organizations that can help out in their locality. So like Code for DC is a really active community that has done really good work to help DC residents.
Right.
And there's a lot of that around, right? So if you look to your left and your right, if you go to Code for America and you look for the brigades, you'll likely find that. But I think you'd be surprised at how many organizations have needs, and your skills could be really valuable. Like right now I'm working for Prince William County, right? I'm the director of digital services at the moment, trying to help them solve tech problems and think about things from a user perspective and how to drive modern approaches, whether it's in the technologies we choose or in the way we procure it, right? Like people don't realize how much impact you can have. Like one last anecdote is like when I was at USDS, I would say like if we came in and we helped work on something that was broken at the moment, it was like helping set a broken bone, right? So we then built up a little bit of political capital, right? And we could come back and say like, maybe your arm feels better, right? Maybe you should listen, and maybe how about we go to the gym? How about we eat better, right? And that's procurement, right? Like so I often talked about the fact that like USDS designers, engineers, and product people were building political capital for us to like have the large scale impact over time. And procurement was such a really important aspect of that, procuring things in an agile fashion and making sure that organizations know how to measure it and apply metrics to procurements so that we can validate that we're getting the value out of it, right? Like those are the things that and for a long time I was the USDS team in procurement is called the Procurement Audi, and I was like a secret procurement Audi member because I was an engineer and I would help them with like evaluations. So I would often help out whether it was writing RFPs or whether it was like actually sitting in on the evaluation panels. And I think that you don't realize just how many skills are required in government to help make things better. And a lot of what you probably do today could be done in government and could have a huge impact.
It's incredible. I think that's a great spot to end that on. And before we let you go, we got my one last question I ask. So we're going to jump in a time machine. We're going to go ahead 10 years into the future. And when that door opens, what's future you saying thank you to you for?
Yeah, I think it's hopefully that I've set myself up for the ability for myself and my wife to retire, to get to the point where we get to enjoy the rest of our life. Whether it's that I've been lucky enough to found a consulting company, and I've had contracts from the moment the company's been open, and that's really been powerful. But the idea of like by joining Prince William County, it was easier for me to come in as a contractor at the moment. So I founded a company, and that really sort of fast forwarded me into sort of the management consulting or the consulting space to help people. I think the thing that's amazing is like, if I could be in a position to set it up so my wife and I can continue to do important and valuable work, or I can focus on doing important and valuable work that will allow us to then move on to a fruitful retirement eventually. That's what I really care about, right? Like I want to do all these things that drive value, but I think the thing that I care most about is that I've worked really hard. I got my first job when I was 12, and I've been working consistently in technology for 27 years. 10 years from now, I'll be getting close to my 40-year mark, and I think it would be really nice to be able to say that like I did a lot and I created a lot of value no matter where I was. And that led to the ability for me to move on in my career and hopefully transition the work I'm doing to either someone new, pass the company off. Like there's a lot of opportunity there that I think could be good. But I don't plan on growing Holmes Consulting. I just think that there's value that being a consultant allows me to do that I didn't think I would get to at this point in my career. So 10 years from now, I'm hopeful that I am continuing to do that and help more organizations. I think the thing that's really interesting when you work at USDS is you realize you can work on so many different problems at the same time, that when I was leaving, I was really worried about getting sort of locked into one company when I thought about the idea of founding a company, it was that I could do more good and help more organizations solve more problems.
Right.
And if in 10 years I'm able to open that door and see that I've done this with another 50 companies, that would be amazing, right?
That'd
like
be very cool.
That's what I really care about, is knowing that, like, not that I have awards, but that I have like emails from people saying, thank you for helping my company solve a problem. Like that's what I really care about. And then growing the civic tech footprint across the board, like continuing to stay connected and getting people engaged and excited and enthusiastic. I've often said there's lots of driven developments. I have always been an enthusiasm driven developer. If I care about it and I'm engaged and I'm really revved up about it, I can solve any problem. And I use that now in a management and mentoring space, right? Like if I can get somebody engaged and excited about how to solve problems, that is more important than me solving it, because I can engage more people to do that mentorship, right? So that's the big piece for me,
Yeah, I think that'd be a pretty cool thing to go witness and see. Be like, oh, look what we did. You did so much more good between now and then. Great 10 years.
Totally.
All right. Well, thank you, Robbie, so much for being on the show today. This was a great conversation. And for everybody else, thanks for watching, and we'll be on next Wednesday. Till then, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Gene.
Thank you.